The state of Missouri carried out the execution of the man who killed a state trooper. Lance Shockley died by lethal injection tonight at the state prison in Bonne Terre.
October 14th, 2025. Inside the Stark execution chamber at Missouri's Eastern Reception, Diagnostic and Correctional Center, 48-year-old Lance Collin Shockley lay strapped to a gurney. 2 decades had passed since the crime that put him on death row, and he still maintained his innocence in the killing of a Missouri state trooper. As the lethal drugs began to flow, Shockley lifted his head from the pillow, straining to communicate through the soundproof glass to loved ones witnessing his final moments. Moments later, at 6:13 p.m., he was pronounced dead by lethal injection. It was a solemn and surreal ending to a long saga, one marked by a brazen ambush, a painstaking investigation, a dramatic trial with an unconventional twist, and 16 years of appeals and waiting on death row. To understand how this case gripped a community and the justice system for so long, we must rewind to where it all began: a deadly accident on a Missouri back road and the murder of Sergeant Carl Dewayne Graham Jr. On the night of November 26, 2004, a quiet rural highway in Carter County, Missouri, became the scene of a fatal crash. Lance Shockley, then 27 years old, had been riding in a pickup truck driven by his friend and sister-in-law's fiancé, Jeffrey Bayless. By midnight, the truck lay wrecked in a ditch near the town of Van Buren, Bayless gravely injured inside. Shockley stumbled from the crash site and sought help at a nearby home. He arrived at the doorstep of Ivy and Paul Napier, hands bloodied, claiming he'd been in an accident and needed assistance. Paul Napier accompanied Shockley back toward the wreck, finding Bayless slumped in the passenger seat, beyond help. While Napier called 911, Shockley vanished into the night, fleeing the scene of the accident, even as his friend lay dead or dying. When law enforcement arrived, they discovered a grim tableau. Bayless was found lifeless in the passenger seat. Beer cans and a tequila bottle littered the truck's interior, hinting that alcohol had played a role in the crash. A smear of blood was noted above the truck's passenger side wheel well, suggesting someone, possibly Shockley, had been thrown against the vehicle or crawled over it while escaping. By the time Missouri State Highway Patrol, Sergeant Carl Dewayne Graham Jr. took charge of the investigation, Shockley was nowhere to be found at the scene. Sergeant Graham, a respected 37-year-old patrol veteran with 12 years on the force, quickly identified Lance Shockley as a prime suspect in what he believed was a case of vehicular manslaughter or drunk driving fatality. That very night, Graham visited Shockley's home to question him. Shockley, however, denied any involvement in the crash. The trooper also spoke with others who had seen Shockley after the accident. At first, the locals were tight-lipped. One witness, Ivy Napier, initially withheld that Shockley had confessed being the driver, perhaps out of confusion or loyalty. But Sergeant Graham was determined. In the following months, he gently pressed witnesses for information. In one instance, he told Ivy Napier falsely that Shockley had admitted to the crash, feeling cornered. She revealed the truth. Shockley had been driving Bayless's truck and fled after the wreck. This confirmation of Shockley's role in the fatal accident added urgency to Graham's investigation and likely put Shockley on high alert that the law was closing in. By March 2005, Sergeant Graham was building a case to charge Shockley with leaving the scene of an accident and involuntary manslaughter in Bayless's death. Graham's tenacity was well known. He had even given Shockley's sister-in-law, Bayless's fiancée, his business card and expressed condolences, all while methodically gathering evidence. Shockley, aware of the scrutiny, grew desperate. He allegedly warned family members not to cooperate and even asked around about Graham's personal life, including where the trooper lived. The stage was set for a violent confrontation that would shock the community. On March 20th, 2005, the hunter became the hunted. That Sunday, Lance Shockley put into motion a chilling plan to eliminate the man investigating him. Around midday, Shockley borrowed his grandmother's car, a red 1995 Pontiac Grand Am, with a distinctive yellow bumper sticker on the trunk. Witnesses later recalled seeing a red Grand Am parked oddly on the side of the road, just a few hundred feet from Sergeant Graham's rural home that afternoon. Shockley's timing was deliberate. He had learned Graham's address and knew the trooper's shift ended around 4 p.m. Sure enough, at about 4:03 p.m., Sergeant Graham ended his patrol shift and radioed dispatch that he was home, backing his police cruiser into his driveway. As Graham stepped out of his vehicle, a gunshot cracked through the quiet country air. Shockley, lying in wait, shot the trooper from behind with a high-powered rifle, the bullet piercing Graham's ballistic vest and severing his spinal cord at the neck. The ambush was brutally efficient. Paralyzed and knocked to the ground by the first shot, Graham could not even reach for his service weapon. He crashed onto the pavement, suffering skull and rib fractures from the fall. In those few horrifying moments, he was still alive and conscious until Shockley approached his downed target and fired twice more at point-blank range with a shotgun, blasting the trooper in the face and shoulder. It was an execution-style coup de grace, intended to ensure that Carl Graham Jr. would never rise again to continue the investigation. The 12-year highway patrol veteran was found dead in his own driveway, still in uniform. Within the hour, a fallen officer who had been ambushed just steps from his door. The murder of Sergeant Graham, a dedicated lawman and father, known affectionately as Dewayne, sent shockwaves through the region. Fellow officers arrived to a devastating scene. In a poignant display of respect, members of the highway patrol saluted as Graham's flag-draped coffin was carried at his funeral days later. This was not only an attack on a single trooper, but on the entire law enforcement community. Investigators immediately suspected the ambush was linked to Graham's work, and their suspicions quickly turned to the very man Graham had been pursuing. Shockley's plot did not end with the trigger pulls. He knew investigators would come after him, so he attempted a hasty cover-up. That same evening, around 7 p.m. on March 20th, Shockley's wife handed a box of .243 caliber rifle bullets to his uncle, relaying a cryptic message. Lance said you'd know what to do with them. The implication was clear: the ammunition, which matched the likely murder weapon's caliber, needed to disappear. But by then, law enforcement was already on his trail. Within hours of the shooting, Missouri Highway Patrol and local officers descended on Shockley's residence. A SWAT team hid in the woods around the property as investigators approached to question him. Shockley was not immediately arrested that night. It's possible authorities needed more evidence to firmly tie him to the murder, but the net was indeed tightening. Evidence collected in the ensuing days strengthened the case against Shockley. Witnesses had reported the red car near Graham's home, and Shockley's own grandmother confirmed he had borrowed her red Pontiac Grand Am that day. Tire tracks or eyewitness accounts placed that car at the scene during the critical window when Graham was killed. Investigators also recovered bullet fragments from the crime scene and later from Shockley's family property. Forensic analysis showed the rifle bullet that struck Graham was deformed, but belonged to the .22, .24 caliber class, consistent with Shockley's .243 caliber hunting rifle. In fact, fragments of .243 caliber rounds found on Shockley's uncle's property, where he often practiced shooting, matched those recovered from the trooper's body. Although the murder weapons were never found, the circumstantial evidence was mounting. 3 days after the murder, on March 23, 2005, police moved in to make an arrest. Shockley was initially taken into custody for the crime that had started it all, leaving the scene of the fatal accident that killed Jeffrey Bayless. Within days, prosecutors formally charged him not only with that offense, but with first-degree murder for Sergeant Graham's killing and an accompanying count of armed criminal action. The motive, prosecutors alleged, was clear. Shockley murdered the trooper in a desperate attempt to halt the investigation into Bayless's death. By murdering Graham, Shockley likely hoped to derail any charges for the DUI crash that could have sent him to prison. If that was his plan, it backfired catastrophically. Now he faced far graver consequences. As Lance Shockley was led away in handcuffs in late March 2005, headlines blared across Missouri. A state trooper had been ambushed and killed, and one of the trooper's own investigative targets was now the suspect. At Sergeant Carl Dewayne Graham Jr.'s memorial, law enforcement from across the state mourned, while Shockley's hometown of Van Buren grappled with how a familiar husband and father could be tied to such a brazen killing. Justice moved slowly. Not until March 2009, 4 years after the murder, did Shockley stand trial. The venue shifted from rural Carter County to Howell County to seat an impartial jury. When proceedings opened March 22, 2009, the state alleged a calculated ambush Shockley, fearing charges from a fatal crash Graham was investigating, borrowed a red Grand AM, parked near Graham's home, and lay in wait. Neighbors noticed the unfamiliar car with a yellow sticker. Ballistics linked bullet fragments to a .243 caliber rifle. Investigators said Shockley had sought Graham's address and later tried to dispose of ammunition. The defense pushed back no eyewitness, no murder weapon, and a circumstantial case. Witnesses placed Shockley 14 miles away around the time of the shooting, and experts disagreed over fragments. Shockley didn't testify, but he maintained his innocence. After days of testimony, the jury deliberated roughly 3 hours and on March 27, 2009, found Shockley guilty of first-degree murder. The penalty phase deadlocked, reportedly 11-1 for death, triggering Missouri's unusual rule allowing the judge to decide. In May 2009, Judge David Evans imposed death, a rare judge-sentenced capital case that would fuel years of appeals. For the next 16 years, Shockley's lawyers challenged the judge-imposed death sentence, raised alleged jury misconduct, and argued the evidence was too thin, citing untested DNA items and expert disputes. Missouri's High Court affirmed in 2013. The U.S. Supreme Court twice declined review. By 2019, state appeals were exhausted. On March 31, 2025, the Supreme Court refused a final petition. Despite 31,000-plus clemency signatures and bipartisan concerns, Governor Mike Kehoe denied clemency on October 13, 2025. Inside the prison, Lance Shockley spent his final hours with a few people closest to him. That morning, he was allowed visits from his 2 daughters and a close friend, according to prison officials. One can only imagine the gravity of those last conversations, a father saying goodbye to his children, professing his love and perhaps his innocence one final time. For his last meal, Shockley did not request a lavish feast as some condemned inmates do. Instead, he opted for simple comfort foods available from the prison canteen: peanut butter, 3 packs of oatmeal, water, and 2 sports drinks. It was a humble, sparse meal, perhaps reflecting Shockley's state of mind or prison regulations on last meals. As evening fell, Shockley was led into the brightly lit execution chamber. He was secured to a gurney, IV lines inserted into his arms to deliver the lethal chemicals. Witnesses filed into 2 observation rooms. One side for Shockley's chosen witnesses, family or friends, the other for the victim's family and state officials. In total, 7 people attended on Shockley's behalf, including at least 1 woman with whom he was close, while 12 of Sergeant Graham's family members and colleagues were present to represent the victim, alongside 13 official state witnesses. Before the execution began, Shockley was given the opportunity to make a final statement. He had prepared a written message, which was now read out. In it, he chose words of Scripture to leave behind. So also you have sorrow now, but I will see you again, and your hearts will rejoice, and no one will take your joy from you. Shockley said in his final statement. The line, a quotation from the Bible, John 16, verse 22, seemed directed at his loved ones, a promise of meeting again, and a hint that he sought solace in faith. There was no explicit mention of the crime, no apology or admission. True to form, Lance Shockley left the world still asserting, by omission, that he was not guilty of the trooper's murder. At approximately 6 p.m., the lethal injection process commenced. A cocktail of drugs flowed into Shockley's veins as he lay on the gurney, his head resting on a small pillow. According to reporters, Shockley raised his head and tried to speak or mouth words to the witnesses behind the glass to his left. One woman, perhaps a relative, pressed her hand to the window and attempted to carry on a conversation, even though no sound could pass through the thick glass. This exchange went on for about 90 seconds until Shockley, already beginning to succumb to the anesthetic, laid his head back down and fell silent. Emotions ran high in the witness room. The woman who had been communicating lowered her head, others wiped away tears, while some sat stoically, staring at the man they knew in his final moments. On the victim's side, Graham's family members watched intently, faces set with a mix of sorrow and resolve. At 6:13 p.m. on October 14, 2025, Lance Collin Shockley was officially declared dead. The long-delayed sentence had been carried out. Shockley's body was removed, and witnesses quietly dispersed, the entire procedure having unfolded with a heavy formality. As news of the execution rippled out, reactions underscored the case's emotional complexity. Outside the prison, the anti-death penalty protesters bowed their heads in disappointment and grief when they learned Shockley was gone. For them, Missouri had, in their view, taken a life of a man who might have proven his innocence if given more time or more testing. On the other side, law enforcement officials and many Missourians felt justice had finally been served for the murder of Sergeant Graham. The state's Highway Patrol Superintendent, Colonel Michael Turner, publicly praised Graham as an exemplary officer, the very best of the force, and said he hoped the execution would be a reminder that Missouri backs its police and will not let their killers go unpunished. The Graham family, who had waited 20 long years for this moment, released a statement that captured the bittersweet nature of the day. The murder of Dewayne Graham, they said, has left a profound emptiness in all of us that touches every part of our daily lives. No execution, no court proceeding could ever bring back the husband, son, and brother they lost. Nor can it heal the hole left in our hearts, they noted somberly. However, after 2 decades of legal twists and turns, they did feel some measure of peace, knowing that this part of the process was over. In other words, while it wouldn't bring Dewayne back, at least they would no longer have to endure appeals and headlines about the man who killed him. They could finally begin to close that chapter, however painfully. At Sergeant Graham's gravesite, perhaps the family could tell him that justice, in the earthly sense, had been done. For Missouri, the execution of Lance Shockley marked a notable moment. He was the first person executed in the state in 2025, and in fact no further Missouri executions were scheduled for the remainder of the year. Uniquely, Shockley's execution coincided with another on the same day in Florida. 72-year-old Samuel Lee Smithers was put to death an hour later for a separate double murder, meaning 2 executions occurred in the U.S. within a single evening. Such events are grim reminders that the death penalty is still practiced, though increasingly infrequent. Shockley's case also reignited discussions about Missouri's death penalty system. The fact that a judge's decision, not a unanimous jury, sent him to the execution chamber did not sit easily with some. In the years leading up to Shockley's execution, a bipartisan group of state legislators had even proposed eliminating judge-imposed death sentences, arguing that it concentrates too much power in one person's hands. Those proposals had stalled, but the issue remains in public discourse, amplified by cases like Shockley's, where a single juror's vote for mercy was effectively overridden. Lance Shockley went to his death declaring himself innocent, leaving unanswered questions that will likely linger. Were those mere legal maneuvers, or was there any truth in his claims? The Missouri Attorney General's office firmly believed the right man was convicted, pointing to the compelling, if circumstantial, evidence. Prosecutors noted that even if DNA tests were done on items from the scene, it wouldn't erase the web of evidence tying Shockley to the crime. Shockley's defenders, however, will always wonder if someone else could have been involved or if a critical piece of proof was missed. Such doubts are not uncommon in long-running death penalty cases and contribute to the intense emotions surrounding them. In the end, the case of Lance Collin Shockley is a story of devastating loss and the pursuit of justice, marked by both dramatic twists and the slow grind of the legal system. It's the story of a state trooper ambushed for doing his duty, a family robbed of their loved one, and a defendant who spent 20 years insisting the system got it wrong. It is also a cautionary tale about the far-reaching consequences of a single violent act. 2 men's lives ended, one murdered, one executed, and many others scarred by the events of March 20th, 2005. For the community in rural Missouri, Sergeant Carl Dewayne Graham Jr. will forever be remembered as a hero taken too soon. And for those who followed the case, the image of Lance Shockley speaking a final prayerful message before the lethal injection, "Your hearts will rejoice, and no one will take your joy from you," remains a haunting coda to a tragic saga.